Hey, everybody. I'm here with Tim Pratt, author of many, many things, which we will go into, but also three of the stories in this triptych, which
Those are so pretty.
they're gorgeous.
Wow.
Yours are on the way.
Good.
Yeah, there's even little touches like the way across the spine, the 1, 2, 3 had this like unified band
Yeah.
that
I
matches up when you put them on your shelf.
well, that whole like Art Deco design aesthetic is I just love it.
There's more detail on the backs of these books than there
Oh
are on the
wow.
covers of almost any of my books. Like it's unfortunate because we had to put like promo stuff in a SKU, but there's
hmm
stuff underneath here that's also just stunning. But look at all this little detail.
Who's
I
the
love it.
designer?
It's I know the guy's name, but the company is Imperial Ink Spiral Design.
That's cool.
Um, but I've got the guy's name. We've been talking. This was a year ago that we got
Right.
the cover done, so it hasn't been in my mind. I'm terrible with names anyway. But I'll put it in the comments of the video, so if anybody's interested from this bit of our conversation, they can find out. You before we get into your writing, one of the things I'm most fascinated by you, and the hints of it can be seen over your right shoulder there. You're one of the more voracious readers I've ever known, ever come across. What's a typical reading schedule for you, just to blow some people's minds here?
I read about 100 books a year, and that's held pretty steady since I got out of college. And I'm not like a full-on quantified life count every thing that passes through my life person, but I do like to sort of keep track of how many books I read. And especially the past couple years, I've been reading for awards. I'm one of the judges for the Ray Bradbury Prize that
Oh,
the
cool.
LA Times Book Awards
Yeah.
just launched last year. And so that's been a ton of reading, and I'm doing it again this year with Kelly Link and Tananarive Due are the other jurors. Yeah, so I've been reading a lot of science fiction and fantasy the past couple years, which I always like, but I also, when I have time to read for pleasure, read a lot of mystery and crime too.
You know, I can see that in your writing a bit too. That you read outside the genre. There's a well-roundedness that comes
Thanks.
from a broad taste in books. I didn't write my first book until I was kind of forced to read and review about a book a day for a website, and I was
Oh yeah,
reading just crime and thrillers, which I never shied away from them. I sprinkled them in, but I never read them with such in such density before. And my writing that came out of me after that was like an explosion of creativity. I found that the more that I was taking in, the more I had to give out. Have you found that with reading so much that it just makes your writing easier?
yeah. I mean, you have to fill the compost heap that is your brain, right? And I read nonfiction, I read popular science stuff, I read tons of fiction, I read comics, and all of it kind of mushes together. And I've written so many stories that were responses to other things that I read or that were inspired by, or I'll read something and think, oh, wouldn't it be cool if they did X thing? And the author goes another way, often it's a better way, but still I thought, wouldn't it be cool if you did whatever? And so I've written a lot of stuff that's come from that direction. And I also think that the more examples you see of the different ways that people handle things in fiction, the more tools it gives you for your own repertoire, right? Like, I'll read a book and be like, oh, that's a really cool point of view trick, and then I'll pick it up. There's Joe Lansdale and his Drive-In trilogy was the first time I encountered this great POV trick where, he's got a first person narrator and then they meet another character and that character has like a long story to tell. And he just drops into a first person from that other character's perspective. And it's a totally different voice. It really like changes up the whole structure of the book, right? And it gives you this sort of deeper embedded thing that's much more dynamic than if someone just reported to you what the exposition was. And that's a technique I've stolen in a lot of my books.
So I did that in my very first book, and then I didn't know the rules, what you weren't supposed to do. And my editor
Yeah.
at the time called it head hopping, which
Yeah.
I'd never heard of before. And I fixed it and made it conform to their standards. But honestly, when I go back and read the rough draft, my version is much better. I
Yeah.
prefer the head hopping. And then I found out that this is kind of a recent rule that if you go back and look at some classics, head hopping was a thing and no one cared.
Yep.
So I've learned to be a little more wary. I was very unsure of myself back then. I've learned to be wary of someone saying you can't do this. Now I ask why, and has anyone else ever done it, and how can you do it with enough savvy that you pull it off, rather than just
Yeah.
a blanket no.
The only rule is, does it work? Does it work for that story? And it doesn't always. Not every technique works for every book or every story. But being exposed to that wide swath of literature, seeing all the different ways that people approach things, can give you a sense of how expansive fiction can be.
Yeah, and I get a lot of people asking, like, what's the first step to being a writer? And I tell them just to read a lot. You have to absorb. And I think of it like musicians. You say you pick up this technique from another writer, and musicians just live in the music before they start writing their own. They play covers, and you learn a blues chord or a riff or some technique, whether it's manipulating the strings or being a percussionist on your guitar, something that you never thought of before. And I don't think there's any substitute for learning to write like there is in just absorbing good story.
Yeah, filmmakers are like that too. You have to learn the vocabulary, you have to learn what works for you, and then you figure out, how can I replicate that, or how can I alter that, how can I incorporate that technique into what I do. There's no way to do it except to experience it.
And no way to know what's not being done as well. So
Yep.
if you read a lot of science fiction, like I did growing up, and I knew what stories weren't there, that really honed me in on the stories I wanted to tell. I think some people fear if you read a lot, you're going to write derivative stuff. And I found the more I read, the more original I got.
No, I think that's true. I think that if you have only read a little bit, then that's going to be the only set that you have, the only sort of set text to the approach. So yeah, I've always been a big advocate of reading widely and writing widely. Try different things. If I ever reached the point where I felt like this is a kind of story that I can write really well, I try to go write different kinds of stories. Try to work at the edge of your competence.
I think anybody scrolls through your bibliography, they're going to see that. You can tell from your cover art. And I think you manipulate your name a little bit, right, to hint at people.
Yeah,
that
I had
the TA and.
Yeah, I had an urban fantasy series, and they wanted to sort of brand it as its own thing. So they wanted, to make it clear that it was all this one, because it's like 10 books about the same character. And the publisher just wanted to sort of differentiate it from my other work. So we did that. And I've had a couple other things appear, and it was always the publishers. I'm vain. I would have everything just under Tim Pratt forever. It's fine. But I'm not a marketer. If the marketing department says we think this is going to work better, then I figure it's their job. Maybe they know.
I think you should listen to yourself more. I've talked to a lot of different authors about this, and then I listen to my readers. I write, I've written romance and young adult and horror that's so graphic. I tell people not to read it, and I do it all under my name. And I found that if people like your writing style, like you talk about, we both mentioned our wide reading taste. Publishers tend to really put readers in really narrow silos and think they only read one kind of book. And as a bookseller, I quickly learned that was not true, that people love all kinds of stuff. And if someone falls in love with your prose, they'll go wherever you take them. And I think too many authors water down their brand and make marketing more difficult by thinking that they have to have different names for different styles of writing. I don't know that there's anything to back up this publisher-driven idea of a different identity for every genre.
I tend to agree. I mean, when I follow an author, I'm more interested in their voice and their worldview, their point of view, than I am in the particular genre that they do. And certainly in science fiction and fantasy, like, there are people who only want to read hard SF. There are people who only want to read books with elves in them. But the vast majority of people I know kind of read all across the genres of the fantastic. So to me, it totally makes sense to keep it all there.
Yeah, and the cover art does a big part of the heavy lifting and warning. If you're only into hard sci-fi, there's covers of mine and yours that no hard sci-fi author would pick up. Like,
yep.
I think that branding is so much more important than the author branding. But just everything is now so searchable. It's all, Google and Amazon algorithm driven. One of the things I tell, and I don't know that I'm right on this, but it's a strong feeling I have. I tell writers, come up with one brand and make it be your own. Like, be yourself, unless there's a fear on why you can't do that. If you're a woman writing in a population that wouldn't give you the same access and rights, there's some Middle Eastern countries where hiding your sexual orientation, hiding your gender makes sense, but otherwise being yourself seems to help more than it hurts.
Yeah, there's very rarely has there been an author whose work I really loved and I encountered something that they did outside their usual range and I thought, oh, I don't want to read that.
Yeah.
Like Kate Atkinson is one of my favorite writers, great mystery writer, and she's also written spy thrillers, and she wrote some really weird historical novels, and it's all Kate Atkinson. I'll read all of it.
Have you had an opportunity to write in the comic realm since you are?
I haven't. No, I've never done comics. I'm certainly interested in it. I read comics a ton, but no, it just hasn't come up. Yeah.
Yeah, I learned a lot from growing up on comics. Just the the idea of telling short stories within your bigger story and cliffhangers and how to structure chapters. And I think it would help more than just the genres of the fantastical, as you say it, to even literary people. I think not embracing comics as a genre of literature at a very young age really hampers a lot of development of young writers.
Yeah, no, I tend to agree. And the stuff that you can do with the combination of visual and textual storytelling is really powerful. You know, I forget who it was who said comics are words and pictures, and you can do anything with words and pictures. Maybe it was Crumb, but I always liked that line.
Let's talk a little bit about your stories in these anthologies. First thing I want to ask is, have you ever been to Burning Man?
Weirdly, I haven't,
Okay.
and I sort of thought you might ask me that. So I'm in Berkeley. I'm in the Bay Area. So certainly I know lots of burners, and I've had, my wife has been to Burning Man many times. I've had partners over the 20 years that I've lived out here who were seriously into Burning Man. I have packed cars for the trip, and I have cleaned the playa dust off. I haven't gone because while I love art and I like drugs, I do not like being uncomfortable. I don't like being dry and hot and covered in said playa dust. So for my vacations, I tend to go somewhere where I can sit by a pool and drink something with fruit and rum in it.
I've heard so many horror stories about the playa dust, and then I got there and didn't notice it at all. Like,
oh, good.
And it wasn't because I was on a lot of drugs, even though I did try drugs for the first time out there, and really enjoyed it to the point that I was really looking forward to going back this year and doing more drugs, but I have to wait a year.
Yeah.
But you end up just like laying in the playa dust, and it just, I don't know, never bothered me. The whiteouts didn't bother me. But so you might be less uncomfortable there than you think. But so in your stories, though, there is this art project, and there's a type of music that makes you seem like such a happy-go-lucky, bubbly, cheerful guy. It's hard to reconcile with the way you present the artistic expression in the story, which is like a very violent, like lashing out at the system sort of art, where it's an angry art, and it's a violent art because the idea that you have to just be calm and happy is so pressured on you. Where does that come from? Because it's not how anybody would it's not a story that anybody I think would come out of your brain.
Sure. I have some friends in the metal scene, especially in the local metal scene here in the Bay Area.
You're saying something about the metal scene, that you have friends in the metal scene.
Yeah, so I have friends who play and, these extremely harsh and like angry and loud and forceful bands. And a lot of times it's very politically motivated and it's reacting against. So, I mean, in punk, they had the whole Nazi punks fuck off thing, right? You had this divide because these fascist forces will come in and they'll see something that has a lot of energy and anger and they'll think this is a place for us, right? We're going to use this. We're going to stoke these feelings and these fears. But then you have people who use those same tools to push back against it. And, fascists have to bind together because they're outnumbered, right? Most of us don't want to be like them. That's why they have to form their little clumps and all dress the same and march around, right? And so they fortunately can get pushed out of these spaces. And so I've known people in the metal scene who had to work to like get rid of the, white supremacist bands that would try to come through or whatever. And I always really appreciated that confluence of art and activism. I like to think that in writing I can change some minds and maybe open people up to new perspectives and all that. But these people are out there like pushing people out the doors of the club, saying that this is a space and you're not, those ideas aren't welcome here, And there's a line from a song I like that says, sometimes a poet runs out of ink and has to fucking scream. And to me, that's the genesis of, I don't know if I can say fucking, but
sure you can. I just had Sean and McGuire on. We've had a lot of F-bombs.
Oh yeah, Shannon's good for that. Um, yeah, so that idea that like it builds up in you and you just have to let it out, and that's what the characters in the story are doing with rack music, right?
Yeah, I feel it, man. It's like it's so palpable, and it's not the way I feel about my artistic expression, but it's the way I feel right now in general. And the reason, we go out in the streets and march, and I haven't reread the story since current events, but it just feels like you wrote this kind of knowing when the book would be coming out. It's so much more powerful now than it was when you wrote it. There must be a lot of the work that you've written over the past that feels more prescient than ever. And where do you take your stories from this? Because we're now starting from a level of kind of discomfort and dystopia that you and I probably have never lived through in our lifetimes. So
Yeah.
what's the next expression? Where do you go? Where do you take your writing from here?
I mean, it's difficult stuff. Like writing in this time, I'm sure you've experienced this too, is really strange and difficult. I sort of struggled with why am I even bothering to make up these stories when so much stuff is happening in the world, right? Like I should be out there trying to affect change in the world. And the thing is, you can do both. You can be out in the streets and you can also be typing. What I've always tried to do in my work is just do for other people what fiction did for me. So I grew up in rural North Carolina. And was very conservative, was extremely Christian. I didn't meet an out gay person until I went to college. Frankly, I didn't meet a Jewish person until I went to college, right? And the racial divides were really powerful. In my high school cafeteria, all the white kids would sit together and all the black kids would sit together. We were in the same school, but there were still these invisible lines drawn everywhere. And I would have not known that wasn't the way the whole world was had I not had fiction. I had books and they opened my eyes to this other world, to this range of political views, this range of sexualities, this range of personal choices, the ways that you could be in the world. And I realized there was so much more to life than that. I mean, it's part of why I now have ended up living in Berkeley, California, right? My life has sort of taken some paths that I never would have taken because it wouldn't have occurred to me that they were possible. So what I want to do to the extent I can is in my fiction also show other lives are possible.
Yeah. Where did you grow up in North Carolina? Because it sounds like we had very similar backgrounds.
I grew up in Dudley, so not far from Goldsboro, Eastern North Carolina.
Okay. I grew up outside of Monroe.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, not far from you.
Yeah, really.
Yeah,
Swamps and soybean fields.
Yeah, the same kind of experience. Very well, except we didn't have a lot of minorities. Like when I went off to school, and then later, like we spent a year living in the Bahamas, where it was the opposite extreme.
Yeah.
It was really eye opening, and I think that's where living in cities where you have more of a mix and traveling and getting a sense of what the rest of the world is like is so important for people loosening up their really hardened political views. Like I just talked about healthcare with Shannon, and the rest of the world has systems that work and don't leave anybody behind. But if you don't travel, you don't see that other countries actually are doing fine and taking care of people. You can kind of stay rural and just hear that in Canada no one gets any health care and believe that.
Yeah. I mean, it's been shown that people are less xenophobic when they spend more time with people from other cultures, right? Like when you get to know them as people, you find them less frightening. They're not a scary monolith, right? Part of why my wife and I have a 12-year-old, and when he was born, we talked about, oh, should we move somewhere cheaper, right? Like where we could like have a bigger house and all that stuff. But honestly, having my child grow up in a place where you can walk down the street and hear 3 or 4 different languages spoken in that day, I think is just so meaningful for the way, he's going to grow up. Like he has friends who have, 2 moms or 2 dads or 3 parents or, trans parents, right? And like that stuff would have been just unimaginable in the childhood that I had growing up.
Yeah, it's easy to look at ethics as a type of vocabulary, and if you are immersed in it, you don't have to learn it. Yeah. If you're not immersed in it, then it's like learning a second language when you get older, and it's so difficult. But when you've always just known these things are around, then your mind is free to learn the languages of science or some art or music or something else, and not have to learn the basics like I did of the history of the South which I had to learn late in life instead of just absorbing it the first time.
I should say that fleeing and moving to a city is not the only path. I still have dear friends and family in North Carolina, a lot of whom are fighting the good fight, right? Who are out there, turning North Carolina purple, right? Like, who are really pushing to try to make things better and more inclusive. And I admire their courage, and possibly I should have been courageous in that way and stayed there too. But for me, it was important for me at the time that I left when I was, 22 or whatever, that I see more of the world.
Yeah, I totally agree. The way our electoral college works, if you wanted to make a big difference, it wouldn't take many people to move to a swing state and have more change there than tweeting all day will get you. Which is my attempt to affect political change, which I know is ridiculous.
Can't hurt.
It's my therapy. What are you working on now that you're excited about?
I just turned in copy edits, so I'm now pretty much done with my next book that's coming out from Angry Robot early next year. It's called The Doors of Sleep. And I honestly, I feel like it might be my best novel. And it's probably got the easiest high concept sort of description of any of my novels. It's about this guy who, whenever he falls asleep, he wakes up in a different branch of the multiverse. So every day he essentially starts over from scratch in a totally different place. And these are not like a multiverse, a parallel reality where, the Hawley Smoot tariff wasn't enacted, right? No, this is like there are alien spider priests who run all of society, right? This is he wakes up in an orbital habitat, or he wakes up in a place full of, basalt pyramids full of tentacled horrors. Like, this is a multiverse. This is a weird thing.
Sounds like a Rick and Morty episode.
I was working on these before I ever saw Rick and Morty, but yeah, that idea of piling through, I
love that, because you get to share every wild idea you can think of.
Yeah.
Does he ever want to go to sleep really quickly because this multiverse is terrible? And
oh yeah, no, that's the thing. He's got as much as he can, whenever he can. He gets his hands on sedatives, whatever. Eventually, he learns sort of biofeedback and meditation techniques and stuff to help him. Eventually, he does, and it's stimulants and depressants, right? If he's in a decent world,
you find true love. You don't want to go to sleep.
It's rough, and he has, he travels sort of with whatever is in his immediate vicinity, so he can take people with him. He learns early on that if he takes someone with him and they're not asleep, it's bad for ways which I won't get into, but it doesn't end well for the person who's conscious during the transition. But if people are also unconscious, he can take them with him. But that's a big thing, right? Because you can't go back. He has no control over where he goes. It's completely random, and it just starts happening to him. It was super fun.
This sounds like Groundhog Day, but the exact opposite.
My agent said that it's like Quantum Leap meets Doctor Who. Imagine you're stuck in a malfunctioning TARDIS and it just took you somewhere new every single day and dumped you out, in the middle of nothing. So
I love that. It feels like my 2020 so far. Every day I wake up right. And I'm like, that's the thing I was worried about yesterday is no longer a thing. And now there's this other crazy thing. So
every day you open Twitter and see what the fresh horror of the day is. Yeah.
That's awesome. Well, I love Angry Robot and all the stuff they do. I cannot wait to read this one. That's a great pitch. And Doors of Sleep is such a great title.
Yeah, they showed me they're approaching their final cover concept, and we'll probably have it out soon, and it looks really sweet.
Cool. It's on my radar now, man. That's exciting. Well, it's great talking to you, man. Good seeing you. Thanks again for contributing to the anthology. It's just
thanks so much for asking me. It was really neat to think about writing stories that would stand alone but sort of add up to a whole. I love the whole idea.
Yeah, I haven't even explained when I hold these 3 books up to people that every author wrote a miniature trilogy that's in these books, and there's a lot of different ways to enjoy them. I know some people will read a story they love, and instead of continuing on through the book, they'll open up book 2 and book 3 and wrap that up, which is probably the way that I would read them, and the way I did read them as I edited them.
Right.
But good luck on your book, and good luck with this global pandemic, and I will see you.
Too.
I'll see you on the playa next year. It's not as uncomfortable as you think.
Yeah, we'll see.
We'll do some drugs together.
All right. I'm there.
All right. See you, Tim.
Thanks, you.